most of you know, like, I'm one of the new directors for the New Jersey World War II Book Club, and I couldn't be more proud and honored to be so. I came up with, because our holiday that we just passed was the first holiday that we had since John had passed. And it really, like, I thought, we have to do something that's special. So I was reading over the holiday General Woodmeyer book, and I thought, it's all about the unsung hero. And if people listened to him, we wouldn't have had the Vietnam War, we wouldn't have the Korean War. So that's the importance of listening to the unsung, intelligent people that are out there. They need to have a voice, and we need to find them. And so that got me into looking at a lot more issues and finding more people. And I'm thinking, now's the time, because if you look at the news and you look at all the things that are being fed to the younger generation, there's not a lot of quality or things that of substance to get them interested in looking into World War II history. So I've been very fortunate. I was talking to Miller, one of our members, and he's going to try to get me a celebrity to help me find one. But this is what I started, was the John McLaughlin World War II Unsung Heroes Club. And when people find an unsung hero, and I want families to get together and find one. Could be your grandfather, could be your grandmother, could be your neighbor, someone like that. Doesn't have to be somebody famous, but someone who made a contribution or, you know, a significant achievement or just anything. And because I find all the stories really interesting. So that's what we came up with, and I'm going to be giving them to people that, you know, come up with one for me. And I think that it's just a nice way of doing it. What we can do, because I do have a Facebook page, but a lot of people don't have Facebook, but you do have email that Richard sends out to. So if you can send an email to Richard of somebody that you would like to be honored and a little bit about them, then I would absolutely post them. All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. Do you have more of these chains so people can see them? Or do you have more of those that they can see? Or?
Yeah, well, I can just pass this around.
Okay. And now I'd like to introduce Andrew Lane.
Thank you. Hey, good evening, everybody. My name is Andrew Lane. I'm the son of a World War II vet, active military as a JAG officer, the oldest recruit in the history of the New York Guard. And I just wanted to share a couple of, hold the microphone. I wanted to share a few words that the late Governor Brendan Byrne had shared with me personally. Many of you are aware, of course, that our late great governor has recently passed. And probably many of you know that he was a World War II veteran. But what he shared with me was that he flew 51 missions over Germany as a navigator in a B-17. And he shared that with me more than once, because I congratulated him once on a Veterans Day, and I got the aircraft designation wrong, and he corrected me in my tracks. So I thought it was apropos to share this at this occasion. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm proud to introduce Steve Twomey, who began his career in journalism as a copy boy at the Chicago Tribune when he was in high school. After graduating Northwestern University in 1973, he began a 14-year career at the Philadelphia Inquirer, during which he won the Pulitzer Prize for writing and served as a correspondent in Paris and Los Angeles. He then worked at the Washington Post for 13 years as a reporter, an editor, and a columnist. More recently, he has written for Smithsonian and other magazines, and has taught narrative writing at the graduate journalism schools of New York University and City University of New York. The author of Countdown to Pearl Harbor, as well as the ghostwriter of What I Learned When I Almost Died. I'm sure there's a story behind that.
It wasn't me who almost died. Someone else.
Okay. Twomey lives in Montclair, New Jersey with his wife Kathleen Carroll, the former executive editor of the Associated Press. So without further ado, Steve.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Yes. If you can't at some point, please start waving handkerchiefs, hands, anything that you have. Good evening, and thank you for extending the invitation to be here with you tonight. It's such a knowledgeable group already that I have a feeling some of you should be up here and I should be out there. But nonetheless, thanks for inviting. During the years I was researching this book, I had an email exchange with one of the better writers about World War II, someone far above my pay grade. Her name is Lynn Olson.
Excuse me for 1 second. We have to correct.
Oh, it's supposed to go to the other side.
Yes. Now lightning won't strike us.
Perhaps some of you have heard of Lynn Olson. She wrote a book, among others, called Those Angry Days, which is a terrific book, and I'm getting nothing from her for that plug. But it's about the fight between Franklin Roosevelt and the isolationists in the country, led by Charles Lindbergh, in the years just before Pearl Harbor. And during our exchange of emails, Lynn mentioned something. She told me that the question she's most asked when she gives a book talk is something like this. Did Roosevelt know that the attack on Pearl Harbor was coming? Or another variation of that question is, did Roosevelt want Japan to attack us? We might call this the Great Pearl Harbor Conspiracy question. It's probably one of the longest surviving conspiracy arguments in American history, another being who really killed Kennedy, and another being we didn't really land on the moon, did we? I too have heard the Pearl Harbor conspiracy question during book talks. And so I thought tonight it would be fun to tackle this question head on. Now, and in the process, I think you'll learn a lot about what really happened at Pearl Harbor. The underlying premise of the great Pearl Harbor conspiracy question is that Roosevelt was seeking some really enraging, galvanizing blow that would overcome the American public's reluctance to get into the war that had been raging since 1939. He wanted a way to rally us around the flag. And even before the war was over, books and articles were being written about a conspiracy and a cover-up. In 1944, the war ended in 1945, you remember. I don't mean that you remember it personally. I remember that you remember it from your readings. In 1944, a man named John T. Flynn published an essay called The Truth About Pearl Harbor, which sort of implied that we hadn't yet been told the truth. And he argued that Roosevelt had been plotting to get us into the war since January of 1941. Many books have followed along the same lines, and you can tell from their titles what their conclusions were. One of them was called Betrayal at Pearl Harbor, published in 1991. Another is Day of Deceit, The Truth, again, the truth as if we didn't know the truth. The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor, and that was published in 2001. Just this past month, in December, someone named James Perloff stated flatly in an article that Pearl Harbor was a deliberate disaster. Now, I don't know who James Perloff is. I've never heard of him. But he alleged this, and I'm quoting him. Comprehensive research has shown not only that Washington, the city, not the person, knew in advance of the attack, but that it had deliberately withheld its knowledge from our commanders in Hawaii in the hope that a surprise attack would catapult the U.S. into World War II. Now, he put the word surprise in quotes, indicating he didn't really think it was a surprise. It was something that had been expected. And in a way, talk of a Rooseveltian plot was quite understandable in the days and years just after Pearl Harbor. Because what had happened at Pearl Harbor left the American people absolutely stunned. They were dumbstruck. Not because of the scale of the loss in ships and in people. The average citizen actually only had a vague sense of how bad the attack was. And the American public wouldn't really have the details of the attack for quite some time, months. And the reason for that is there was no Facebook or Twitter to spread eyewitness accounts of what had happened. There were no satellites up there beaming live TV images. Anderson Cooper wasn't standing at the side of Pearl Harbor going, look at this disaster. People had no idea. And military censorship quickly kicked in to curb what was published in the way of photographs and articles. Not that articles couldn't be published, but what they said was certainly monitored. And there was a good reason for that. The War and Navy departments did not want the Japanese to know which ships had been hit, which had been sunk, how many planes had been destroyed. That would be helping the Japanese understand how successful their attack had been. The only thing the public knew in December 1941 was that our mighty Pacific Fleet had been ambushed by a race of weird little people who were supposed to be militarily third-rate. The Japanese were not regarded as good flyers, good mechanics, or bold innovators. Yet they had caught our boys at port on a sleepy Sunday. And not only that, they had then gotten away clean. We never caught them in those days afterwards. Let me read to you something from the book, and excuse my disconnection here. On the night of December 7th, after the attack, Franklin Roosevelt called a cabinet meeting. And after the cabinet meeting, he wanted to tell them what he knew about Pearl Harbor, and not even he knew that much. After the cabinet meeting, the Secretary of the Treasury, a man named Henry Morgenthau, went back to his office at the Treasury Department, which was right next door to the White House. And it was just past 11 p.m., and Henry's staff was still there in the office waiting to hear what he had learned at the meeting. And he gathered his staff and he said this, that Pearl Harbor was, quote, much, much worse than he had expected. Now, he didn't mean that he knew details. He just was referring to they really had caught us. He did not understand how this could have happened, he told his staff. It made no sense. Quote, it's going to be the most terrific shock this country has ever had, he told his staff. He said it again. He could not understand what had happened. Quote, the Navy had the whole fleet in one place. The whole fleet was in this little Pearl Harbor place. The whole fleet was there. He kept saying it again and again as if it was beyond his comprehension. In that atmosphere of utter shock, it didn't take much for people to begin offering a conspiratorial answer to Morgenthau's question of what had happened. Pearl Harbor was so shocking, in other words, that to some people, the cause could not be any misjudgments by Americans or any misunderstandings among American military and civilian commanders. And it could not reflect a capable enemy. No, the cause had to be treachery. There had to be somebody on our side who wanted this to happen, who set the table so it would happen, and who covered it up to this day so that we would never know the truth. Now, you and I could spend hours dissecting the statements and documents that people have offered over the decades as evidence that Pearl Harbor was a conspiracy. But I think a better approach to this, is to pose a very simple question. Does the notion of a plot pass the smell test? And I'd like to break the answer into several components and take them one by one. There may be some overlap in doing that. The first thing I'd like to discuss is the allegation that Franklin Roosevelt knew the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor specifically, that he knew an attack fleet from Japan was on its way to Pearl Harbor. Now, the snappy and smart alecky response to that allegation is, how would Roosevelt have known that? I know of no evidence that Roosevelt had a personal spy in Tokyo who passed information only to him and to no one else in Washington that therefore only he knew. No back-channel mole that regularly mailed letters to the White House that said, "For Franklin's eyes only." In fact, the U.S. never had any spies in Japan during that period. Instead, Roosevelt knew what he knew through the most obvious way, through the Washington bureaucracy, and to some extent from the British. The primary source of American intelligence about the Japanese Army and Navy and their operations was their radio transmissions, which we would snatch out of the air and analyze. And it's an imperfect and incomplete system at best, but that was the best way we could figure out what they were doing. Any such intelligence that we snatched out of the air and gathered about Japanese plans would have to have come to Roosevelt through a long chain of subordinates, starting with radio intercept teams out there in the Pacific, code breakers, because all their messages were in code, translators, because once you decoded a message, it was in Japanese, so you had to have someone translate that. And then message couriers who would take the messages around to the chiefs of Army and Navy intelligence, and then to the chiefs of the Army and the Navy, and then to presidential aides, who then gave it to Roosevelt. So if American eavesdroppers had in fact picked up evidence of a pending raid on Hawaii in the fall of 1941, and if that information about a coming attack had been passed all the way up the ladder to the White House, then quite a few Americans, not just Roosevelt, knew that avoidable death and destruction had then occurred. Not only that, every single one of them went to their grave without disclosing that astounding fact. Because I know of no sworn testimony or memoir or deathbed confession in which anybody revealed, hey, we had known that Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor, but we kept quiet about it until now and then died. In other words, there were not only numerous people, including the highest civilian and military leaders in the nation, not only were numerous people dishonest and treacherous, they were not the least bit guilt-ridden in their later years by their own dishonesty and treason. Excuse me. It's often said, well, they must have known because they must have known the raid was coming because we had broken Japan's code. Yes, we had broken their code, their diplomatic code. That's the code used by the Japanese Foreign Ministry to talk to its embassies around the world. And we were reading those. And they were read almost in real time in 1941 at the White House and throughout the government. And it was clear from those diplomatic messages that Japan was growing increasingly desperate and might lash out. But not one of those diplomatic messages ever spelled out a plan to attack Pearl Harbor at any time, let alone attack it on a specific date. And so I'd ask you to think about this. Why would the Imperial Navy, which was going to be the force that executed the attack, why would the Imperial Navy have felt it necessary to disclose its Hawaii plan to the Foreign Ministry if the most important aspect of that plan, by far, was that it must be executed in complete secrecy in order to achieve surprise? Sure, the Foreign Ministry in Tokyo might have been told by the military that Japan was going to go to war and go to war with America. But that isn't the same as having the Imperial Navy tell the diplomats how they were going to do it. And even if the Foreign Ministry and its diplomats in Tokyo had been told that Hawaii was going to be the target, why would the Foreign Ministry have then turned around and sent a cable that could be intercepted by the Americans to Washington saying, here's the operational detail, we're going to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Ambassadors had no need to know the military details. In fact, the Foreign Ministry didn't really have full confidence in its ambassador in Washington. He was a man named Nomura. He was a former Navy admiral, and he worried deeply about war with the United States. He liked Americans. He enjoyed being in Washington. So he hardly seems to be a candidate to get a message from Tokyo that said, hey, Nomura, your worst fears are about to come true, buddy. We're going to attack Pearl Harbor. It's just implausible. Now, if we had also broken Japan's naval code, in addition to its diplomatic code, we might have figured out that Pearl Harbor was going to be a target. But we did not solve the naval code we hadn't solved the naval code at that time and couldn't read its messages and wouldn't be able to read those messages until the spring of 1942, well after the war began. Now, you also hear a corollary to this argument that FDR knew. A corollary of it is that Winston Churchill was the source. That Winston Churchill told FDR, the Japanese are going to attack you at Pearl Harbor. And that he had conveyed this without anyone else in the American government ever having heard about it. But that brings us back to the initial question, or a variation of it. How would Winston Churchill have known that? I doubt they hadn't broken the Japanese naval code. And there's no evidence that Churchill had any foreknowledge of the attack. Which brings me to a more general question, which is, well, he may not have known about Pearl Harbor, but Roosevelt wanted us in the war. Well, Roosevelt had certainly picked sides in the war that had begun. He was doing all he legally could to help Great Britain, which was the only power left in Western Europe, standing between the East Coast and the rampaging Nazis. In fact, the United States was doing so much to help the British that it was no longer legally neutral in any sense under international law. The United States was practically at war in the Atlantic Ocean. American destroyers were escorting convoys partway to Britain. American destroyers were shooting at German submarines, and they were shooting back. American ships had been sunk. American sailors had been killed, several dozen of them by late 1941. It's not hard to imagine that this increasing engagement in the Atlantic was going to lead to all-out war with Germany, if that's what Roosevelt wanted, or even if he didn't want it. Germany would have been well within international norms to have declared war on us because we were no longer neutral. We were acting as a belligerent. But let's say this quasi-war wasn't enough for Roosevelt, that he wasn't willing to wait any longer to see what Germany would do, to see if it would bomb an American city or actually declare war. Let's say he wanted to be able to send American troops into combat, and he figured that the way to do that was to engineer an attack on Pearl Harbor so that the U.S. would declare war or be at war with Japan, and that Japan's ally, Germany, would then declare war on us, and he would have his wish. We would be in the war. And actually, part of that scenario happened. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Germany did declare war on us. We didn't declare war on them. They declared war on us. But is that what Roosevelt wanted? Did he really want to be in the war that had begun in 1939? I think logic suggests that he did not want to be in the war. If Roosevelt's top priority was to help Great Britain survive, and I think it was, then initiating a war in the Pacific would be a terrible move. And here's why. First, it would really hurt American efforts to guard those convoys going to Britain. Why? Well, if there was a Pacific War, the U.S. Navy would immediately begin withdrawing ships from the Atlantic and sending them to the Pacific in order to protect Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and the West Coast. That loss of American power and protection in the Atlantic would hardly benefit the British, would hardly help Roosevelt's goal of saving them. And what actually happened was precisely that. After Pearl Harbor, the Navy immediately began relocating ships from the Atlantic to the Pacific, particularly because so many had been damaged at Pearl Harbor. There was real fear in December and January 1941-42 that the West Coast was going to be attacked. There were blackouts in cities along the West Coast. There were riots in Seattle against businesses that hadn't gotten the word to turn off their lights. People were afraid that the lights are going to give us away and the Japanese are going to bomb us. So Roosevelt began immediately shifting ships to the Pacific. The second reason why provoking a war in the Pacific would be a bad play is that it would deeply threaten Great Britain's lifelines to its allies and colonies in Asia, which were India, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Malaya, Hong Kong. Britain relied on those places for many of its raw materials in order to survive in the fight against the Germans. So if the U.S. went to war with Japan, if that's what Roosevelt wanted, Japan would surely then turn around and go to war with America's ally, Britain. And why would Roosevelt want that if that going to war in the Pacific meant that Britain's colonies were threatened and that Britain's resources in the Far East were in jeopardy, which turned out to be exactly what happened. And why would Churchill have wanted that? Why would he be hoping for a war in the Pacific? If he got a war in the Pacific by not telling Roosevelt that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor, that would hardly be working to that would make his situation a lot worse. But let's all together be an advocate for the devil, and let's you and I agree for the sake of discussion that FDR wanted to go to war, that he knew Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked, and he allowed it to happen because that served some other purpose. If all of that was true, even if we concede all of that, then unlike our current president, FDR was not a very stable genius. Here's why. By the last week of November 1941, the entire world knew that war was about to break out in the Pacific. The entire world knew that large Japanese forces were on the move. It was literally in the papers. And hold on while I find the page that tells you that. Actually, I think I can do it from memory. The New York Times on Friday, December 5th, said something to the effect of the situation was really serious. And the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, said that all meetings now in Washington were of the utmost seriousness. So the fact that, and this information, by the way, that everyone knew, did not come because we had cracked any Japanese codes. It came from people's eyes. What do I mean by that? Well, foreigners living in Japanese-occupied China. Japan had been at war with China since 1937 and had occupied many of the coastal cities. But there were still foreigners living in those cities. And they watched as Japanese troops boarded ships in the ports of occupied China. And those ships then set sail and went south. Other people, similarly, diplomats and others, were watching the buildup of the Japanese army in French Indochina. French Indochina was no longer really French because the French had been defeated by Germany. The Japanese were able to pretty much put a gun to the head of the French and say, let us base some people in your territory called French Indochina. And so people were watching. There were more and more Japanese troops building up in French Indochina. Vietnam, Cambodia, what is now Cambodia, Vietnam, and the way I'm missing one.
Laos.
Thank you. I knew there was one more. And so the knowledge of a massive, imminent Japanese operation also came from a study of the radio traffic, I mentioned earlier, of the Imperial Navy. We could not read those messages themselves because they were in that naval code. But by examining who was sending to whom, and by studying the patterns, U.S. Navy eavesdroppers knew that a very large Japanese force was at sea and moving south. What was lying to the south? Well, it seemed likely that the destinations for these forces that were now at sea were Singapore and Malaya, those British colonies I mentioned before, which were close to Indochina, independent Thailand, the East Indies, which were a Dutch colony, and most important of all, the Philippines. The Philippines were an American possession. There were army bases there under the command of someone you may have heard of, Douglas MacArthur. And it was also the headquarters of the U.S. Asian Fleet under the command of a really remarkable guy named Admiral Tommy Hart. And as November gave way to December and it became obvious that the Japanese were really pulling off something here, it seemed more and more likely that the United States was going to be attacked in the Philippines. Admiral Hart, in fact, began to scatter his ships in advance of the Japanese because he didn't have enough to stand up to them. So forget about Hawaii for a moment. It's hard to imagine the United States would not have declared war on Japan if the Philippines had been attacked. This was American property. There were American citizens there. Roosevelt knew that the Philippines were in Japan's crosshairs, and all of his military men knew it. So there would have been absolutely no need to sacrifice the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor to get into the war, because war was already at the door in the Philippines. And if, in fact, the Japanese had left Pearl Harbor alone, we still would have gone to war. And by the way, Japan did attack on December 7th and 8th, did attack all those places. Pearl Harbor was actually only a small portion of the Japanese plan on that day. Now, you might have a reasonable question in response to all of this. if we knew about all this massive movement going on toward these colonies in the Southwest Pacific, why didn't we see the fleet coming to Hawaii? How come we missed that? Well, unlike the operations that were occurring and headed to the south, the strike force headed to Hawaii was a ghost. Now, I wish I had a map of Japan here to show you, but the force that was headed to Hawaii departed from one of the most isolated spots in the Japanese Empire. If you can picture a map of Japan, there are 3 or 4 main islands, and then north of that there's a string of islands that today we call the Kurils. And one of those islands is where this strike fleet for Hawaii gathered and prepared to attack. This was a very small bay on a very isolated island, and all of its links to the outside world had been severed. There was no telephone lines. There were few people on this island, but their telephone lines had been cut. They couldn't use radios because they didn't want anyone on this island to transmit the presence of this attack fleet. Word of its departure was reached no one's ears on the outside. No one saw it leave. And there were 30 ships in this attack force, including 6 aircraft carriers. And they sailed across the North Pacific in silence for 12 days. They did not use their radios, not even to talk among themselves, among the 30 ships. So there were no transmissions for Americans to intercept and analyze. Nor did this fleet even send out reconnaissance planes in front of it to see who might be out there. Because if a pilot got lost in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, he couldn't, if he radioed, "Where are you guys? I can't find you," that would give them away. So they didn't do the most elementary thing a military force would do. They didn't scout out in front of them. They took their chances. So this fleet was never heard and never seen. And so the surprise on December 7th was not that war had come to the United States. Franklin Roosevelt and his government and the American people had an overwhelming sense that the days of peace were about to end. And they were going to end in the Southwest Pacific. The Philippines were going to be attacked. Instead, the surprise on December 7th was that Hawaii turned out to be one of the targets. Roosevelt, in fact, was so convinced that war was going to break out, that the Japanese were going to start one, but not in Hawaii. He was so convinced that it was going to break out somewhere, that on the evening of December 6th, that's the day before, he sent a cable to Japan, not to its government. He went over the heads of the military and civilian leaders in Tokyo and sent a personal letter to the Emperor of Japan, the most revered figure in all of the empire. In this letter, whose tone is really sort of sad, he noted to the emperor, "Look, we know your forces are moving in the Southwest Pacific, and all of those places are really nervous. The Dutch East Indies, Singapore, all those people think you're going to attack them." And he basically said to Hirohito, "Let's work things out." Quote, "to prevent further death and destruction." Now, you can choose to believe this was a cynical, last-minute document that Roosevelt wrote only for the record to provide cover for the fact that he actually wanted a war and to make him look reasonable in the eyes of history. Or you can choose to believe that this was a genuine desire for a way to avoid disaster. And I don't think there's much doubt about what it was. He was trying at the last minute to avoid a calamity. For all those reasons I mentioned before. Did you have a question?
I have a question. why are you not mentioning July 1941, when the United States, Great Britain, and the Dutch set an embargo on oil and rubber to Japan?
I'll get to that. If you'll let me finish the thoughts, I'll get to that when we get to the questions and answers. Finally, I'd like to delve into something that the gentleman I referred to before, named Perloff, had written. Remember what he said. Washington had, quote, deliberately withheld its foreknowledge from our commanders in Hawaii. Now, of course, you cannot withhold information you don't have. And as you've guessed by now, I don't think Washington had knowledge of a raid coming on Hawaii. There's zero evidence of that specific allegation. But let's examine the issue of what the commanders in Hawaii had been told. On November 27th, and this is 10 days before the attack, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor received a message from Washington. Its first sentence had 9 words. 9 words that had never appeared in any naval dispatch in American history. That alone was a sign of unprecedented danger. The sentence read, quote, "This dispatch is to be considered a war warning." This is 10 days before this allegedly engineered attack. Why had Washington sent that? Why had Roosevelt and his men sent that? The answer is what we've already talked about. Washington knew Japan was moving its forces in large numbers. It still didn't know any targets precisely. So the message went to all U.S. naval forces in the Pacific: Hawaii, Panama, the West Coast, the Philippines. The message went on to list or suggest some possible targets, including the Philippines, but not including Hawaii. Even so, the message did tell the fleet commander, his name is Husband Kimmel, one of the most tragic figures in American history, for reasons I'll be happy to explain further if we get to that point. It gave Husband Kimmel a direct order to take certain steps, even though the Pacific Fleet was a long way from the Southwest Pacific. It's 4,000 miles from Honolulu to Manila. And even though he was given this order, even though there was no evidence that Hawaii was going to be attacked, what he was told was this: execute an appropriate defensive deployment. In other words, Washington was saying this: hey, Admiral, it's time to start thinking about protecting yourself. The Army on Oahu received a similar message. Why would Washington have sent such messages if it wanted to keep the Army and Navy in Hawaii in the dark about the threats? Kimmel responded to that war warning by telling all of his ships at sea to immediately attack any unknown sonar contact. In other words, if they picked up evidence there was a submarine, don't wait for any orders, attack it. That suggests he understood the situation was pretty serious. It was getting bad, so bad that he could no longer let his boys be sitting ducks if they detected a submarine. They could shoot first. He could have begun aerial reconnaissance to search for the Japanese if he had wanted to. Nothing stopped him. A week later, on December 3rd, Washington told Kimmel that intercepted Japanese diplomatic messages indicated her embassies in Washington, London, Singapore, and the East Indies had been told to start destroying their code machines, their code books, and all their secret documents. That, to most people, meant only one thing: Japan was going to war against all the countries named in that message. The reason you destroy sensitive materials at your embassies is you fear that otherwise, once the war breaks out, the host country will burst in and seize all your secret stuff. All your codes will be compromised. Again, why give Kimmel that information if you're hoping that Pearl Harbor, if you know that Pearl Harbor is going to be attacked and you think you're fine with that? On Saturday, December 6th, Washington told Kimmel that in light of the deteriorating situation, he could tell Navy and Marine outposts on the islands of Wake and Midway, which were much farther out in the Pacific, he could tell them to destroy their code materials. The fear, obviously, was that Japan might be about to attack them, and nobody wanted their secret materials seized. And so I asked one more time, why increase Kimmel's wariness if you're deliberately intending to keep him in the dark? Finally, on December 7th itself, Washington frantically sent dispatches to Hawaii and the Philippines after it decoded a Japanese diplomatic cable that indicated that something was going to happen that day at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So the message went out to Hawaii and the Philippines, and it said this: just what significance the hour may have, we do not know, but be on alert. The message didn't reach Kimmel in time. By the time it did, the attack was underway. But the point is that Washington did try to warn him. It wasn't trying to keep him out of the loop. Now, I suppose you could argue that the reason for all these cables that I just spelled out was that although Washington hoped Japan would strike Hawaii, it didn't want the Pacific Fleet hurt too much. So it gave Kimmel just enough clues so that he would ratchet up his alert levels, perhaps man his guns, maybe even take the Pacific Fleet to sea where it would be safer than staying in port. That way, Japan would have started the war, but not inflicted too much pain on American ships, and perhaps would suffer some pain in return. Well, in that case, if that's your plan, why even be coy about it when you're messaging Kimmel? Why risk the chance that he'll figure out what he's supposed to do? Why not just tell Kimmel the Japanese are approaching Hawaii? Why not just tell him to take the fleet to sea? If Kimmel had sent out reconnaissance and it had discovered a Japanese task force closing in on Hawaii, say on December 6th, it would have been obvious to the entire world what Japan was up to. It would have been obvious that Japan was about to attack Pearl Harbor. Otherwise, why are there 30 ships sitting out here 200 miles from Hawaii? In righteous self-defense, Kimmel could then have attacked first. And from what I know of his character, he would have. If that had happened, Roosevelt still would have had his war, but with much less sorrow on our side. America would have looked quite innocent and reasonable, because it would have been innocent and reasonable. Not too many people would have argued that Kimmel should have just sat there with his ships, waiting for an attack by the enemy, an enemy he knew was there. In summary, the notion of a plot fails the smell test on multiple levels. And that leaves the question that Henry Morgenthau had posed. How could this have happened? I'm going to very quickly give you some reasons. Very quick. Pearl Harbor happened not because any Americans wanted it to, but because too many Americans couldn't imagine the Japanese sailing so far to pull off an attack that even Kimmel himself would later admire. He actually said after the attack, that was beautifully executed. Pearl Harbor happened because in those last days of peace, Kimmel really didn't want to assume some sort of defensive crouch and use up all his planes in long-distance search for an enemy he didn't really believe could be there. Instead, he wanted to get ready to go after the Japanese once the imminent war began down there in the Southwest Pacific. Pearl Harbor happened because Washington didn't try to find out what Hawaii was doing to protect itself after that war warning was sent. And so it did not know that Kimmel had decided not to begin searching for the enemy. Think about that sort of management bizarreness. You warn someone and tell them to take appropriate steps, but you don't really ask them if they have. And Washington just assumed that Kimmel was doing the right things, and Kimmel wasn't. Pearl Harbor happened because until the Imperial Navy did it, no Navy in history had ever grouped aircraft carriers into a single massive force, and thus Americans had no way to gauge how much damage more than 300 airplanes could do if they arrived over your fleet sitting in a harbor. The Japanese were ahead of the world, and these Japanese, who supposedly were not very bold innovators, were ahead of the world in realizing that the aircraft carrier was the new weapon of naval warfare, as it remains to this day. And Pearl Harbor happened because Americans thought, and this seems very small, but it's crucial, Pearl Harbor happened because Americans thought that if a plane dropped a torpedo into the waters of Pearl Harbor, that weapon would merely bury itself in the bottom mud because Pearl Harbor was so shallow. And it is. As major ports go, it is extremely shallow. At its deepest point, it's only 45 feet. Nobody on the American side imagined that the Japanese were capable of overcoming that problem. And they did. The single greatest cause of damage on December 7th were torpedoes. That's what ruined the Pacific Fleet. In conclusion, Pearl Harbor was not the result of a plot. It was the result of boldness on one side and poor assumptions and decisions on the other. And I'd be happy to take your questions. If you'd like me to address this gentleman's question, I'll repeat it. He was asking about, in July 1941, the United States slapped extremely painful sanctions on Japan, primarily cutting off all of its oil. The Japanese islands have almost no natural resources that a then modern Navy needed, particularly oil. They got all their oil, just about all their oil, from us. And it's often said that because we took away their oil, we made them desperate, and understandably they then went to war with us because we had been so harsh to them. But you have to ask, why did we slap sanctions on them? We slapped sanctions on them because they were misbehaving all over the place. They had been at war in China since 1937, and we kept trying to get them to stop. They had seized part of French Indochina and then another part of Indochina, even though we had told them, don't do that. They saw military expansion as the primary means of getting what they wanted, instead of through negotiation and commerce and trade. And so blaming Roosevelt for provoking the Japanese because he punished them, you forget the reason. He didn't just do that just because he's, a mean guy. He did it because they were misbehaving, to put it gently. The best book I've ever read on what happened in Japan is a book called Japan 1941. It came out about 4 years ago by a Japanese American, and her conclusion was essentially that Japan went through a period of craziness, that nobody really stopped the train of war in Japan because everyone was afraid to speak up, and going to war was crazy, but they were going to do it, and they kept doing it even though we kept telling them, don't do that. And if Roosevelt had not slapped sanctions on them, I have every reason to believe Japan would have still kept on attacking people. So I don't think you can blame, put the punishment, you're putting carts before horses if you blame Roosevelt for having provoked Japan. Japan was the provocateur here.
I had read that in January of 41, Yamamoto was given a mission to build this military action, this plan, whatever they called it. And that was a year, almost a year.
The plan was actually, Yamamoto was the, Ishiruko Yamamoto is one of the most fascinating people in American history. I guess he's fascinating in our history, but he's certainly fascinating in Japanese history. Very complex guy who loved to gamble in every sense of the word. If there was a game of chance, roulette, 21, poker, he would play. He once said that his ideal life would be to move with his girlfriend. He had a wife, but sort of. To move with his girlfriend to Monaco and just play at the gaming tables all day. The plan was Yamamoto's. He wasn't ordered to do it. It was his idea. He is the one who came up with the idea of attacking Pearl Harbor. Now, this is a whole other evening we could spend together. The idea of attacking Pearl Harbor was fiercely debated within the Japanese hierarchy. Many people thought it was nuts that they couldn't possibly sail that far undetected. And therefore, it was a suicide mission. In fact, people on those 30 ships, most of the men on those 30 ships had no idea where they were going until just before they left. And when they heard, oh, you're going to spend 12 days and sail for 3,000 miles toward the biggest and most important American naval base in the world, and you're going to attack it, they all thought, well, that's it, we're dead. Seriously, they all thought they would get Japan's highest military honor for having done this, but that none of them would get it in person because they'd all be dead. And so whether to attack Pearl Harbor was a huge debate within Japan. And Yamamoto finally said, look, if we intend to go to war in the Southwest Pacific, the only force that can threaten us in the future is the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. And so I want to take that out on the first day of the war so that they can't threaten what we want to do down in the Dutch East Indies and Singapore and Malaya. And he finally convinced them that taking this risk was worth it. And when they got all the way across the Pacific and no one had seen them, they were amazed that no plane, no ship spotted them coming. They couldn't believe it. They could not believe they had reached to a point 230 miles off the coast of Oahu, undetected. It was, in a sense, it's a miracle for them, but it was also a reflection of discipline and planning. And it's funny, Japan is, of course, one of our closest allies today. But I think my impression is that they remain extremely proud of the military aspect of Pearl Harbor. That it was militarily, it was an amazing achievement. And it was. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
The Admiral Kimmel, General Short, and their children defended their reputation. Any commentary?
Yes, Admiral Kimmel, why did I say he's one of the most tragic figures in American history? He had a perfect record up until December 7th, 1941. He was your mind's eye image of an American admiral. He looked the part. People were amazed at his organizational ability, and he had an unblemished record. And shortly before 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning, the phone rang in his house. The admiral lived in a house that's still there. In fact, a month ago, I was in it. It's the home of where all commanders of the Pacific Fleet to this day live. The house sits, if you've been to Pearl Harbor, you know that there are small little hills right around it, and this house is on top of the hill. By small, I mean it's only a couple hundred feet up. But you could see the whole harbor from up there. And shortly before 8 o'clock, the phone rang in his house, and he was told that there had just been a flash signal from the control tower at the airfield on Ford Island that there was an air raid going on. And he went out onto the lawn of his house wearing his white uniform, which hadn't yet been fully buttoned. And he looked down and he could see the sky was filled with planes and that they were swarming all over his battleships. And one of them was already beginning to tip over. And his neighbor, the wife of one of his captains, came out and stood with him on the lawn and watched. And she said that he stood there like a marble statue, incredulous, because he knew his career was done. He had completely miscalculated about Japan's ability to pull off an attack like this. And within a few days, he was fired and replaced by someone you might have heard of, Chester Nimitz, who led the Pacific Fleet throughout the rest of the war, literally into Tokyo Bay. Kimmel actually hoped he would get another assignment. He had waited his whole life to be in a war. He had been in World War I, but only at the margin. He expected he would get another assignment, but it became clear that the Navy and the White House wanted him to retire. And he did, because he could read between the lines. And over the years, he began to, my words, buy into the theory that there was a conspiracy, that information had been withheld from him, that he was being unfairly singled out. His sons, he had 3 sons, one of whom was, 2 of whom I think, I forget now, one of whom was certainly was in the Navy and died during the war, went down with his submarine. So everything about Kimmel is tragic. He began to fight to have his day in court, literally a day in court. He wanted a Navy court-martial at which he could prove that he was not responsible for this. The sons took up that fight. They've now all passed on. His grandsons have continued that fight. One of them lives in Cocoa Beach, Florida, and is a former Naval Academy. He's a Naval Academy graduate who served in the Navy, then became an FBI agent. And I went down to talk to him, and that's a whole other story. But they continued to fight to restore his reputation because they believed that he was made a scapegoat. And that always suggests to me that that somehow he shouldn't have been punished. Husband Kimmel should have been punished. He made a lot of bad decisions, which we haven't talked about tonight, but remember the message about the that he got that the Japanese were burning their codes and destroying their machines, everyone else thought that was a critical piece of information. It didn't faze him. He didn't think it meant anything. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I read, I don't know if it was your book or it was a similar book, but I read that there was one of the big reasons that this surprise attack was successful was the fact that the naval officers, I don't know which one, I don't remember the names, really just couldn't imagine that the Japanese could do anything like this.
No, I think that,
You know, and that you haven't emphasized here, but in the book I read, it was very strongly emphasized that there was just so much prejudice that they couldn't imagine.
that's right.
Yeah, okay. So maybe it was
Actually, in March of 1941, several months before Pearl Harbor, two high-ranking officers on Oahu, one Army and one Navy, actually wrote a report that said, you know what? Someday, in advance of a war, and as the way they would start the war, it's possible the Japanese would show up here with some aircraft carriers and attack the fleet. They weren't the only ones who had envisioned that. The possibility of an attack had been thought of. But it's almost like one of those checklists where you go, yeah, okay, we thought of that, we discussed that, we discussed that. And everyone sort of shoved that into the background because it seemed so implausible. Why did it seem implausible that they could do that? Because we couldn't do it. There was a feeling in the Navy that it could not sail all the way to Japan and attack Japan. Why? You have to refuel your ships at sea. You can be spotted easily. And so, in a problem that's called mirror imaging, you end up thinking, well, if we can't do that, then they can't do that. We ascribe their inabilities, our inabilities, to them. And so, while the possibility of an attack like this had been thought of, it didn't really stick because it just seemed crazy. Yes, sir.
Just a couple of historical points. Number one, the Japanese had a wooden navy in 1870. By 1905, they were so capable with iron ships trained by the British Navy that they sank the entire Russian fleet in 1905. Number two, going back to my point, the day after, I think it was July 26th, Nomura shows up, I believe the Secretary of State was Cordell Hull.
He was?
Shows up at his office and says to him, the day after that embargo, you tell your president to reverse this because this is an act of war. My country does not have these things, which is one of the reasons they were going into Southeast Asia to get the oil and the rubber, okay? The third thing is, let's go back to 1940, Wendell Willkie versus FDR. What did Willkie say? You are going to go into a war if you elect this man as soon as he and Churchill can put the thing together.
Well, I've given you all my reasons why I think it's not logical to ascribe to FDR a desire to get into the war.
I'll tell you the reason he got into the war. To end the Great Depression.
Well, we were already, production in the United States of war and armaments, of war weapons and armaments, had skyrocketed already before 1941, before Pearl Harbor. We were producing thousands of planes and tanks in preparation for the possibility of war, as you would do if you were a responsible and reasonable president. You wouldn't let your country just assume that Germany was never going to attack you. So we were already pulling out of the Depression in the days before Pearl Harbor because Congress had passed bills for billions of dollars in expenditures. So I'm not quite sure I agree that we did it solely, that he got into it to pull us out of a depression. I really don't. Yeah.
I'd be interested in your opinions about the General MacArthur and his actions right after Pearl in the Philippines.
Kimmel was, as much as anything else, Kimmel was upset that he got punished and MacArthur didn't. MacArthur had more warning on December 7th. It was actually December 8th in the Philippines by then. He had more warning that he was about to be attacked, because he already knew about Pearl Harbor, that they still were caught on the ground. And I'm not an expert on why MacArthur wasn't punished, but he probably should have. He was as derelict as Kimmel was.
He has had tremendous notoriety and adulation. He was ambitious, politically ambitious, and he was derelict of duty when the Japanese landed 3 or 4 divisions. I spoke to a gentleman about 2 years ago who was a survivor of the Tan Death March. And MacArthur did nothing to deploy and take action to centralize or whatever military dispositions were suggested to him. He left all of his forces scattered, and the Japanese ran amok.
Yeah, I am certainly no expert on what happened in the Philippines after that, but everything you say rings true. As I said, he probably should have been punished. Yes, sir.
We had a speaker here.
What?
We had a speaker here that talked about the March of the 10th. They told all about it.
Yeah, that's way out of
Yeah, I
my
know, but I'm just saying that we do have
my
that
realm of.
information.
Yes, sir.
I had read that the Japanese took 10 years to prepare for this attack. 10 years.
Well, I guess they had been at war for a long time. They had been at war essentially since 1931 when they took
Right.
Manchuria.
So there's the 10.
But
But I don't think the plan, they didn't have an intention of attacking Pearl Harbor for 10 years. I don't think so.
no.
Yes, sir.
I was 10 years old in 1941, and amongst the kids, when this all came, the kids still couldn't believe it because they used to keep the Japanese equipment, cars, guns, planes, as being incapable. And we all knew, because of the war in Europe, we were all fans of Western European and English and American products. And the Japanese products had no chance, and that was our feeling at that time. How the hell did they do that?
There was a, one of the Navy's, U.S. Navy's intelligence officers was based in Japan sometime in the 30s, and he used to get all kinds of criticism from his colleagues for ever having flown on Japanese domestic airlines from Osaka to Tokyo, because they thought you're nuts to get into a Japanese plane. You'll be killed. Yes, sir.
So you describe this such shock. It was, Pearl Harbor, the Japanese weren't capable. This was really the black swan of 1941, just like the attack on the World Trade Center was a black swan. So as a military historian, if you were advising generals and presidents this day, how do you think in a way to prevent the next black swan?
Yeah, that's a great question, and what happened to the World Trade Center proves that human nature doesn't change a whole lot. It's hard. I think that this is going to sound probably too pop psychology, but I think it's really hard to accept a fact that's going to cause you to significantly change what you already intended to do. One of the things that happened to Kimmel was that he had all of these plans that as soon as the war broke out, I'm taking the fleet and I'm going to attack the Japanese here, here, and here. Yet he was getting information that said, husband, it's a great first name, husband. Husband, look, there's a good chance they're going to attack you first. You have to be thinking about that. And he wanted to do what he wanted to do. He was by nature a meticulous planner. And he just couldn't shake his desire to execute the plan he already had. And so it's really hard to get beyond those mindsets that say, nah, that couldn't happen. You probably have heard the expression red team, that businesses and government agencies often will have, and certainly in newspapers, I know about this. What is a red team? A red team is a group of people within your organization whose job it is to poke holes in what you want to do. That you say, this is the way we're analyzing the intelligence. And you give it to the red team, and the red team goes through it and says, no. What about this? People do this with products that they want to launch. You know, someone will say, you know, let's see if this makes sense. Give it to the red team. Well, there were no red teams in 1941. There really was no way within the War and Navy departments. There was no brainstorming group that said, look at all this information together. What could they be up to? There were just sort of individuals making decisions that they were used to making because things had always gone that way in the past. Should Kimmel have known the Japanese were going to do this? Probably not known it, but one of the standard theories of military operations is you have to imagine what's the worst that could happen. Because if you're ready for the worst, then everything short of the worst you can probably cope with. And they simply could not, even at his most extreme, you know, his most sense of worry. And Kimmel was worried. On the morning of December 6th, it was a Saturday, he held a meeting in his office, which is right there, still there, same building is still there on the edge of Pearl Harbor, because he wanted to ask his officers, his staff, because all this information was coming in. These messages that he had been receiving, they knew the war was going to break out. Have we analyzed this correctly? He even sent a messenger to his closest friend, the captain of a battleship, and said, William, what do you think? And so they did think about it, but he was still worried. And how do I know he was worried? Well, a Marine officer, remember the Marines are part of the Navy, although I think the Marines probably hate it whenever someone says that. But the Marines technically were part of the Navy. And a Marine officer on Kimmel's staff recalled him being all knotted up and feeling pains in his stomach. And the officer asked him, you know, what's wrong? He said, I wish I knew more than I did. And yet, even with that feeling, he didn't do the one thing that in subsequent investigations was almost always cited. He didn't go look. All he had to do was send out search planes, of which he had 81, to see who was out there, if anyone was coming. Now, they may not have found them, but at least you tried. And if he had sent out search planes, his career probably would have been much better, even if they hadn't found anything, even if they had missed them. It's very, very hard. I've never done it, so I'm speaking out of turn here. If you're in a plane up there and you're looking down at nothing but ocean, and there are clouds in the way, remember, radar was very primitive then. The search planes didn't have it. All you could do was look with your eyes. And the chance of missing a ship down there, 10,000 feet below you in the gray ocean, was extremely high. Estimates were that you could only see the enemy coming 50% of the time, even if you went looking. Kimmel didn't even try. And that's probably the thing that his greatest mistake. I'm probably way off your point, but and giving you more information than you all need. Yes, in the back.
You said early on that, and I was surprised to hear this, that
We had no spies all over Japan.
Well, for one thing, for one reason, there's an obvious physical reason why it would be difficult for an American to be a spy in Japan, because you stand out pretty quickly. Let me finish this gentleman's question. The closest we had was the embassy in Tokyo, which had a large staff and had a great ambassador. He had been the ambassador in Japan for 10 years, which is an extraordinarily long time to be an ambassador. And he probably knew the Japanese character better than anybody. And I skipped over this, but he was sending messages to Washington during November that they did say, watch out, they could do something really nutty, my phrasing. They may do something that to you seems really suicidal, but they don't think like we do. You have to allow for that. The best we could do in terms of seeing what the Japanese were up to was asking permission to send out the military attachés in our embassy to make visits to Japanese naval ports, military bases, which diplomats routinely did. The Japanese almost never allowed that. And in fact, when trains would go by a Japanese naval base, a civilian train, the shades on the windows would be pulled down so that if there were any foreigners on the train, they couldn't see the naval base. The chief of naval operations said during testimony that the only thing we knew about Japan was what we could see outside the 3-mile limit. And what he meant was, as soon as you got inside 3 miles into their territorial waters, we couldn't get any farther than that. We didn't know what they were doing. There were no satellites up there. If anyone tried to assemble a fleet of 30 ships today, we'd know it like that. But not then. Yes, sir.
The Japanese are very smart in picking December 7th, because the Army-Navy game was December the 6th.
No, it's actually the week before. It was November 30.
All right.
Yep.
Well, that takes care of that thought.
No, I'll give you a small tidbit from that. The Army-Navy football game was on, I believe it was November 30. I could be wrong. If you give me 2 seconds, I'll check. And it was in Philadelphia. And, Saturday, November 29th. And what's interesting about the Army-Navy football game on November 29th was all the big brass from the Army and Navy went there. The First Lady went to the game, Eleanor Roosevelt. And the program that you could buy for 50 cents was about 200 pages. Much bigger, I think, than a program that you get today. And in the program for the Army-Navy game was a photograph. And what did the photograph show? It showed a line of American battleships. The battleship was everybody loved battleships. They were so cool to look at. And this showed a line of battleships plowing through heavy seas. And the caption read something like, the backbone of the American Navy. People talk about air power threatening carriers, but to date, they never have. And the first ship in line in that photograph was the Arizona. And 8 days later, the Arizona had blown up. And it sits to this day where it sank.
I would like to thank
Thank you all. Here's something. I'd like to say that this was one of the very best speakers we have ever had. And can we get him back?
Thanks, Mom.
the answer is we'll try. There's no meeting next month. It will resume. Hopefully you're all getting the emails now, yes?
Yes.
Yeah.
You still
Still
not?
sends them.
It's going out. You have to check your spam. I can't account for Gmail. Sometimes it bounces back on my own account. So, but yeah, check with people you know then. So I want to thank you all for coming, and I'll send out the emails for the next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.